You are listening to the Wealth Formula Podcast with Buck Joffrey. Get ready to change your life.
Welcome, everybody. This is Buck Joffrey with the Wealth Formula Podcast coming to you from Montecito, California. Today, before I get started, I want to remind you that there is a website associated with this podcast called wealthformula.com. That's where you go if you want to get access to many of the resources not available directly from the podcast, various downloads, books, that kind of thing. It's also where you can go to sign up for some of our lists and groups, such as the Investor Club. If you're an accredited investor, you're interested in being involved with private deal flow, consider joining the Accredited Investor Club. Go to wealthformula.com and click on Investor Club. Hopefully we can get you involved in some things that way as well. Now, as for today's show, I want to talk a little bit about China. But before that, I want to kind of give you some thoughts on just in terms of bias and perspective, because it's what made me think of this was this interview with James Fox. You see, no matter how open-minded you are, what I found is you're ultimately going to approach things with a certain bias. Okay. And it's very difficult not to. It's sort of what, if you don't, it's almost like, just not having gravity. You have to be weighted down somewhere to start. Otherwise you'd go crazy, right? So having biases is normal. And it only takes being completely wrong about something, once or twice that you would potentially even bet your life on to really realize that. And that is really when you just feel like, oh man, I was so wrong. And what else could I potentially be wrong about? A good example of that in my case was, admittedly with COVID-19 in the early days, I actually didn't think it was going to be a big deal. I looked at some of the old data, the early data when it was coming out and the percentages that I was seeing. And I was like, yeah, no, this is not a big deal. People are making too big of a deal of this. And of course, I was totally wrong. I mean, at least in the case of what I call the old guard COVID, which is the first one, and then Delta, these were pretty lethal, dangerous viruses. A lot of people died, and others like me who didn't die. I had the old guard COVID, as you may recall. I got very sick, and it took a long time to fully recover. But anyway, there's two reasons why I say that I probably didn't take this serious. And one was the data that I said, okay? The data was not super impressive. But in retrospect, the more powerful force in my determination of whether or not this was a serious threat was the fact that I was negating the seriousness of COVID because my bias that something like that could not possibly happen in the United States of America. Now, listen, I certainly was aware of SARS and Ebola overseas, but then in the US, you get these little outbreaks of bird flu, things like that. They would fizzle out really quickly. And so I just, in my mind, could not process that that's something that could have happened in the US. Anyway, obviously I was. And when you're wrong on such a serious thing, it makes, again, you realize that your own biases and perspectives are probably influencing a lot of things that you might be wrong about. Of course, as an investor, and that's, where we are in with this show about investing in personal finance, this concept is really, really important. And it's really ultimately, trying to recognize blind spots, right? It's extremely important. For example, remember that digital assets, cryptocurrencies, these are highly speculative investments that involve a lot of asymmetric risk. And aside from perhaps Bitcoin, and some would even argue that, but the risk profile for the majority of these cryptocurrencies, if not all of them outside of maybe Bitcoin, is extraordinarily high. And the chance of them going to zero is still, any one of them going to zero is a real possibility. But you can't, it's sometimes hard to really accept that when people around you are echoing, similar positive sentiments towards a project that you might actually really believe in the team, see tremendous upside and get really excited about it. And a great example of that, specifically in cryptocurrency, just happened, a couple of weeks ago in the case of this Luna or Terra Luna. It seemed like a great project, no doubt, considerable upside, but still had asymmetric risk profile. But I think a lot of people got super excited and kind of fed into it on top of each other. And next thing you know, the real risk of this thing seemed less and less. Like, it was something that, the idea of it going to zero was probably didn't even occur, that it was a possibility to a lot of people who were involved with it. Of course, it did, but it's a long story. I won't bore you with it. You can look it up, the Luna cryptocurrency, but it did go to zero effectively. And that's the end of that. And so I know there's some people who lost a ton of money, and I'm sure it always stings, but hopefully there's an understanding that if you lost money, you did it knowing that that was a real possibility, because we have to remember those types of things, right? At the end of the day, biases like this and perspective, they're all around us. They're everywhere. And the reason I mentioned them, in a prelude to this particular podcast is because my discussion with today's guest, James Falk. James is an expert in China and in relations with the United States and financial markets. His view on China's motives, whether it comes digital currency, like we just were talking about, or the war in Ukraine and, why China isn't doing more, are quite different from what I had expected. And they were kind of eye-opening. And reflecting on this interview, I realized it was just another example of how perspective can really influence the way you view the world. And that shouldn't be surprising. I mean, James is an English intellectual, lived in Hong Kong, right? I am an American who sees China as an adversary akin to the former Soviet Union, right? I see them as sort of a dark force in the world, and I'm not a huge fan of the Chinese government. So this is obviously, we're going to have some differences in perspective, but it's important to be able to listen to others and get their perspective, because the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Anyway, that's the interview you're going to hear with me and James Falk right after these messages. Welcome back to the show, everyone. Today, my guest and Wealth Formula podcast is James Falk. James is a veteran financial and strategic advisor to corporations and governments. He's served as a senior executive at Hong Kong exchanges and clearing HKEX during a decade of rapid internationalization in China's capital markets. And he's the author of Financial Cold War, which is a book which we'll be discussing a little bit here today. James, welcome to Wealth Formula Podcast.
Thank you very much, Buck, for having me.
Yeah, so let's start out with this notion, I guess it's for anybody who's following what's going on between the U.S. and China in the last several years, we can understand why you would call it a financial Cold War. But you want to talk about, why you call it a Cold War, just to start?
Well, first of all, when you use this phrase, financial Cold War, a lot of people's thinking immediately jumps to sanctions, trade wars, and so forth. That's not what I'm talking about. By the time you get to that point, I would say that you're already in a financial hot war. The financial Cold War, as I define it in my book, is the accumulated effects of lots of individual national policies and imbalances caused by the structure of the global financial system, which have contributed to tensions and conflicts between China and America.
Got it. So the U.S., how is the U.S. dollar really at the centerpiece of this financial Cold War between China and the U.S.?
There are a number of elements to the financial Cold War. So the dollar's role in the global monetary system and the imbalances caused by that are one. Other issues include international tax competition. It includes industrial policies, which ultimately has to do with a lot of failures to enforce antitrust policies, which have allowed the flourishing of monopolistic and oligopolistic practices in both countries. And then it's also got to do with incentives, both in the public sphere and in private businesses. As regards the dollar, the US dollar was lodged at the center of the global monetary system by the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944. At the time, the US was accounted for around about half of global GDP. The dollar has been extremely useful in the globalization of trade and investment in the many decades since. But the system that Bretton Woods created ultimately created a fundamental imbalance at the heart of the global financial system. That being that in order to supply the rest of the world with sufficient liquidity to handle the growth in international trade and investment, the US had to keep supplying dollars to the rest of the world. In other words, it had to keep running a balance of payments deficit. And that's all well and good while the US economy continues to grow at least as fast as the rest of the world. But for a long time now, the US has been a large, mature economy, and other countries have been growing a lot faster. And so in order to allow the dollar to continue to serve in that role, the United States has had to go into higher and higher levels of debt. This has created a fundamental fragility at the center of the US financial system. And because of the US financial system's centrality to the financial system of the whole world, it's created a fundamental fragility in global financial markets and made us, frankly, just far more prone to the types of financial crises that seem to be happening more and more often in the previous decades. The other impact of the dollar really is one on the US. The US dollar is quite often talked about as a source of exorbitant privilege in favor of the United States at the expense of other countries. Well, the reality of that really depends on where you sit in US society. So if over the last 40 years you've been the wealthy shareholder of a large US corporation who, because of the demand for dollars in international finance and international trade and the consequent structural overvaluation of the dollar, if you've been able to take advantage of that by outsourcing your production to lower cost centers with undervalued currencies, then you've done very well, because what's happened is you've been able to bring your costs down, your profit margins have gone up, and share prices have gone through the roof. If, on the other hand, over the last 40 years, you've been a US manufacturing worker, the story hasn't been so rosy for you. Your experience has been one of displacement, job loss, at best, long-term wage stagnation. And one of the main arguments in my book is that the benefits of the dollar-centric global monetary system today outweigh the benefit, the costs of the US dollar-centric monetary system today outweigh the benefits, even for most people living in the United States themselves.
This has been a complicated issue for the Chinese to consider, right? The dollar-centric global economy versus their own investments into the U.S. How does that all play out from the Chinese perspective?
Well, the fact is, China has come from abject poverty, and it has, through opening up its economy to the rest of the world and embracing market practices, it's seen enormous economic growth. But the way that China has grown in its early stages were really reliant on a very large labor force. So it happened that a generation of baby boomers was coming into the workforce just right at the time when Deng Xiaoping embarked on this process of reform and opening up in 1978. You also happened to have at that time a number of people who had been politically marginalized under the Cultural Revolution returning to the cities and to the workforce. And you had the one-child policy, which drastically reduced the number of dependents per head of population. So the Chinese government was able to harness the savings that were generated by this growing workforce through its control of the state-owned banking sector to direct investment into government infrastructure and other development properties. And it was a model that has been extremely successful. That's what laid the groundwork for the export boom in China that began in the 1990s. The problem with that system today is that China now is facing a rapidly aging population, and it can't continue pouring concrete as a means of driving GDP growth, because ultimately that's going to end up in massive investment and capital misallocation that is going to have severe costs and consequences for China. So, a consequence of the top-down investment-led economic model that China has pursued is that it has underdeveloped its domestic capital markets. That means that it is heavily reliant on the US dollar in its financial and trade interactions with the rest of the world. And as we've seen more recently, the United States has shown an increasing tendency to weaponize that dollar system against its strategic rivals. And as tensions have escalated between China and the US, this has become a significant source of vulnerability for China.
Interesting. Yeah. So it's, so it is a complicated relationship ultimately. Let's talk a little bit. Let's go back to this idea of the financial Cold War in specifics to, where we are in technology. Artificial intelligence, how does this technology, in your view, how will it influence the balance of power in the coming days?
Coming days, I really don't know, but in the coming years and coming decades, I think it's going to be I think one of a number of highly game-changing technologies. If you look at the power balance between great powers, that there's an economic and financial dimension to that. That there's also, in very large part, a technological dimension of that. One of the reasons why China ended up in the 19th century being essentially very poor and marginalized and frankly subject to a bit of bullying in the international sphere was the fact that in the early 1400s they had taken a decision essentially to scrap the pursuit of maritime technology, and so the Europeans raced ahead and used their lead in maritime technology to colonize large part of the world. That provided the capital that fueled the Renaissance and the sort of technological advances that you saw in Europe through the Industrial Revolution. So technology is always in great power relations a major factor. And whether it's artificial intelligence, machine learning, or other forms of technology, if one or other gains a substantial lead over the other, then it could well shift the balance of power. Now, that could be an entirely benign thing. Frankly, actually, it's great to have some competition because that drives human innovation and development and hopefully a better standard of living for all of humanity. But if a technology gives one country the power to oppress another country or to somehow subjugate them, then obviously that for the target of that oppression and subjugation is not going to be such a good thing.
What is right now? I know you're not. You're in actually in the U.S. right now, but right now with the COVID, the lockdowns, coming out of COVID, the supply chain issues. What's going on in the economy in China right now? Obviously, we have our own issues here that we've been focused on with inflation, and markets are getting demolished and all that kind of thing. But what's going on in China?
Okay, it's been pretty tough. When I left Hong Kong on the 18th of April for this trip, we'd been in 3 months of lockdown. The kids were out of school, people working from home, and the atmosphere was pretty grim. And sadly, we've seen now with the spread of the Omicron variant around other parts of China, you've seen other cities like Shanghai, Xi'an go into lockdown, and that obviously is causing a lot of pressure and causing a lot of social and economic harm. As regards the economic impact of that, I mean, the shutting down of factories and production and so forth will inevitably have a dramatic consequence on China's economic growth. We now live in a rather globalized world, connected not just through trade, but through the intricate intertwining of the international capital markets. And so what's going on in China will inevitably have knock-on consequences and impacts for other parts of the world, including here in the United States. I always find it rather odd that quite often you see in some of the public commentary a bit of schadenfreude being expressed at the travails that China's going through, and likewise that happened in China in 2020 when the United States was going through a rough time. The reality is that given the extent to which the two countries are interlinked and intertwined, the clear self-interest for both countries is in the social and economic well-being of the other. So as regards China right now, they're in a tough spot. I mean, the fact is that we saw this in Hong Kong. Unfortunately, a little bit over a month ago, we had some of the highest death rates in the world. And at that time, Hong Kong U put out a survey or a study on vaccine efficacy. Hong Kong was the only place that I'm aware of in the world where you had the option between the Sinovac vaccine and the mRNA vaccine. And what the study showed was that obviously people who hadn't been vaccinated had very high levels of hospitalization. But of those who had been fully vaccinated and had to be hospitalized, 87% of those had taken the Sinovac vaccine. Unfortunately, it seems that vaccine is not as efficacious against the Omicron variant of the virus. And so if you look at it in those terms, it becomes very difficult. The Chinese government's really between a rock and a hard place, because they're acutely aware of the economic damage of these lockdowns, and frankly, the level of unhappiness and social dissatisfaction that these cause. But unfortunately, unlike here in the United States, where you have lots of doctors like yourself almost on every street corner, in China, there are 2 doctors for every 1,000 head of population, and that population is very dense. And so if they were to pursue the type of opening up that you've seen here in the United States, walk around the street, nobody's wearing masks anymore, then there is a very grave risk of quite catastrophic consequences. I think, rather than delighting in the travails that they face, I think all of us ought to be expressing an awful lot of sympathy at this point.
I want to shift a little bit to the war in Ukraine. Give me your perspective on China's, I guess, lukewarm response. With their perspective, and they just have to do in part with their own potential interests in, taking over various places like Hong Kong in the future, or what is the reason for them not being? Is it a balance of power issue? What with regard to their position on the Ukraine, Russia's in the Ukraine?
But just so I'm clear on the question, I think there are two parts to your question. The first being that why is China not going along with Western financial sanctions on Russia in response to the Ukraine invasion? And then I think the second question is there any read across from China's stance there to issues around Hong Kong, Taiwan?
I mean, that's basically kind of what my thought is. But yes, exactly.
Okay, so I think when you look at this issue, not just from China's perspective, but if you take a step back, I mean, it's a complicated one. No one's condoning Russian aggression in the Ukraine for 1 second. It is something which is absolutely abhorrent and should stop immediately. But if you look at the English language Anglo-Saxon press right now, you get this certain view of the world, which is that, aren't the Russians terrible? And, why is everybody not joining in to these sanctions? I'll first say that if you look at this objectively, that the so-called international order imposing sanctions on Russia right now includes countries representing around 10 to 15% of the world's population. China has very specific reasons for not going along with these sanctions. One is that China is very dependent on Russia for energy and food. It's not self-sufficient in either of those commodities. And the fact is that China in its maritime environments is surrounded by the US Navy. And so, in the event of any dispute with the US, there is a serious security threat to China that access to food and energy through the very narrow Malacca Strait shipping lane could be choked off. So the geopolitical tensions between China and the US have driven China to diversify those forms of supply, and now it's very dependent on imports of those commodities over the Russian border. The second factor is that China shares a 2,600-mile land border with Russia. Russia is vital to the security and stability of a number of countries on China's western border. The fact is that China cannot afford for Russia to be destabilized. They don't want to get on the wrong side of the US either. Frankly, they're very dependent on the US dollar and the US dollar system. And so they're forced into walking quite a tightrope at the moment. But China's not alone in not following those sanctions. And the fact is that India has chosen not to do so. Brazil has chosen not to do so. Part of that has been a calculation of interests. This is a hard-nosed world, and that's a factor. Part of it, I think, also, which I think is more pertinent for an American audience, is that they look at the path to this tragic conflict and they see that there are two sides to this story. And so, on the moral question of whether or not they should be following along with Western sanctions at this point, irrespective of their material and sovereign interests, I think, that they're very reasonable, balanced people. And I encourage people to go and read and listen to some of the views being expressed by very reasonable, level-headed intellectuals in India, in China, and other parts of the world, and then reflect on, I think, what the situation really is.
And what is, and what do you mean by that? What the situation really is? I mean, I guess from the American perspective, and for what we see is an attack on a sovereign country that was not really precipitated by anything that Ukrainians was not precipitated by the Ukrainians in any sort of way. It just seemed like a land grab. So what is the other perspective?
The other perspective is that this was an entirely avoidable conflict. And when you say that it wasn't precipitated, Russia had stated quite clearly that they saw NATO expansion right up to their borders, and particularly into Ukraine, as a major security threat. Now, you can debate the rights and wrongs of that, and you can debate whether that's true or not. But Russian leaders come from a long historical perspective of having been invaded a number of times by Napoleon, by Hitler, right through that sort of that channel. And so I don't think that Russian security concerns were entirely illegitimate. I repeat again that I absolutely abhor violence and the aggression which they've resorted to. But I also believe that there have been a lot of mistakes made by a number of different actors in the lead up to this conflict. And I think the focus now must be on trying to remove Russian troops from the Ukraine and see a cessation of hostilities. And in that, I look at the news and look at the pronouncements by some Western leaders, and I have to say that I hold up my hands in despair, because ultimately the Ukrainians are now paying the price for what has become a proxy conflict between different actors around the world. And when Russia isn't given room to de-escalate and to exit, hopefully gracefully from their perspective, then the only result of that is a continuation of the violence and bloodshed.
Do you see any, we talked a little bit about the Chinese perspective on Hong Kong. Do you see any parallels on, what's going on with Ukraine and the Russians, and how China sees the situation with Hong Kong, and how they may be reacting to it, influenced by that perspective?
Do you mean Hong Kong or Taiwan?
Taiwan.
Taiwan. Well, I'm not sure that there's any direct read across. I'm certain that Chinese policymakers will be paying very close attention to the financial sanctions that the West has placed on Russia in the wake of the Ukraine conflict. Unfortunately, with Taiwan, history has left us with the current status quo. I think, my best advice to anyone would be that we should probably follow Deng Xiaoping's prescription on that and allow that situation to be handled by later and hopefully far wiser generations. And I think that generally that will happen unless that there is unless there is a particular catalyst that forces the hands of leaders either in China or in the United States.
I want to finish up with a question a little bit. I know you have an interest in digital currencies and Bitcoin and that sort of thing. As it relates to China, China seems to have had sort of a tricky relationship with the digital currencies, having, at various times banned mining, Bitcoin, attacks on Bitcoin, et cetera. But then there's also a recent, I believe, you could clarify this for me, but it was recently launched their own digital currency. Can you explain sort of, China's perspective perhaps on digital currencies and what you see the role of it in the future potentially?
So you're right that China's a leader in the drive towards creating a central bank digital currency. And I think that the reason why they're pursuing that is that in China has, frankly, some of the most advanced kind of payment technology, mobile payment technologies in the world. You even, if you're on the street, you're paying a busker, you're doing it over your phone through the Alipay or WeChat Pay app. The problem that China faces is that in many cases that the technological advances has run far ahead of the regulatory frameworks to support it and to govern that. And I see the central bank digital currency as part of an effort to essentially create a level playing field for all financial services companies and fintech actors, so that dominant monopoly or oligopoly platforms aren't able to abuse their position of dominance to stifle competition and to prevent the emergence of newer and more innovative technologies. As regards the attitude towards cryptocurrencies, that's a bit of a distinct issue, and I think that what you're seeing is that China worries deeply about those cryptocurrencies being used as tools for speculation, and they're very concerned about the formation of speculative bubbles and the consequences, both economic and social, even when those burst. But you've also got to understand that in China, the social contract between the state and its citizens has dramatically changed in the past 10 to 20 years. Previously, helter-skelter growth had really ignored environmental issues. China at one point was the largest center for Bitcoin mining. That's obviously a very energy consumptive activity. China still relies heavily on coal for electricity generation. And so the proliferation of Bitcoin miners was having a material impact on the environment. So I think the issues of investor protection and avoiding the the environmental damage involved in cryptocurrency mining were major factors in the Chinese government's decision to crack down.
That's interesting. So your perspective is that the crackdown on Bitcoin was more of an environmental perspective. I think that's sort of unique. You don't feel that there was a fear of, in a very centralized society like China, to have a distributed technology and distributed ledger type currency seems like a good reason to be against it. But you feel like it was a bigger that the environmental issues were really what drove
environmental and the avoidance of speculative bubbles. I think were major drivers. There's no doubt that that there are also concerns about non-state issued currencies proliferating. It's not just China who's sensitive about that. China happens to still have a semi-closed capital account, and certainly I think that the People's Bank of China wouldn't want to see cryptocurrencies being a channel for large-scale capital flight. But in that, China's not unique. If you look at other governments around the world and the way they've responded to cryptocurrencies, and particularly Western governments' response to Facebook's proposal to create Libra or Diem, and the way that they strangled that to death, that's not something that's unique to China.
Well, this has been very interesting, James. Thank you for your time. Again, the book is Financial Cold War, A View of Sino-U.S. Relations from the Financial Markets. I assume that's available in all the usual outlets.
It's available from the usual outlets, Amazon.com. And if you want to find out more about it, you can go to my website, which is jamesafok.com. That's JAMESAFOK.com.
That's great. Thank you very much, James. It's been really interesting to talk to you, and would love to have you back again sometime in the near future.
Thank you, Buck. It's been a pleasure.
Be right back. Welcome back to the show, everyone. Hope you enjoyed it. Again, great example of, some differences in perspective. I have to say, I was surprised about James's take on, Bitcoin and, China's real motivation underlying their being related to environmental issues, which, I still have a hard time believing that that's really the main perspective that China has for attacking the miners and going after Bitcoin. But, James is in Hong Kong. I think he understands the government well, right? And the war with Ukraine, again, it's hard for me to look at it the way he does from a geopolitical reference point that he does, looking at it as, of course, he didn't say this, but an implication that was almost sort of justified from Russia to invade because of this perceived danger from NATO alliances and stuff like that. Anyway, interesting stuff. Hope you enjoyed it. That's it for me this week on Wealth Formula Podcast. This is Buck Joffrey signing off.
Thank you for listening to the Wealth Formula Podcast. Visit us on the web at wealthformula.com. The information contained in this podcast are opinions, not fact. As always, consult your own financial team before making any investment. See you next time.